there's limits to what we can do, and oftentimes what we do is not like it's funny. What we do is I don't know why at this age I'm laughing at that, but it's kind of fitting here because we're going to go on to pollution and stuff, right? We're talking about King Edward the First, for instance, yeah, who we're very likely to do a future video on, right? Because King Edward the First was very, very pivotal in the creation of like English and actually British history. But he was the first person who legislated against pollution. You know, you're talking about like the 13th century, so it's a long, long time ago. The king was concerned about people, especially in London, because obviously London, like kind of even then, was a relatively major city. People used to burn what's referred to as sea coal. We all know what coal is, right? And like, so sea coal is just coal which they just, you go down to a beach like, and you just happen to find loads of deposits there, and so people would just collect it there. They didn't have to dig for anything. They used to just like pick it up and then burn it and stuff, and then that would like heat their home, that would like help with cooking, etc, etc. The problem with that is the amount of steam that ended up, the amount of like, and the smoke that came out of that, it was obviously very polluting and stuff, so very polluting to the air and stuff. And so King Edward I was like one of the first people who actually put legislation in to actually limit and regulate the environmental like kind of degradation. And this is actually something we're going to get into throughout the rest of this video in terms of what is the role of the individual in preserving like kind of the natural world as such, yeah, and what's the role of the government in that same regard. Like, is it government's responsibility, is it individual responsibility, is it a bit of both? These are some of the things we're going to really get into. But as you can imagine, living kind of in this kind of pre-industrial era, the amount of pollution being produced wasn't like the most. It didn't really have that big of an impact on people's lives, really and truly. Like, most people were rural at this point, and you know, they used to collect firewood, which isn't like the greatest to burn, but at the same time, you're not seeing smog, you're not seeing some crazy level stuff, yeah, just from this kind of basic level of pretty much subsistence farming, which is like for the most part what it was. Time we get to the Industrial Revolution, which started in Britain, we end up having a rapid rate of industrialization, but at the same time, as the people are flocking into the cities, as industry is booming and stuff, yeah, we're starting to see on a day-to-day basis the pollution that comes from it. Very famously, in terms of like how this affects nature, for instance, there was a species of moth in Britain, right? So they all started off as pretty much white. The ones that were able to evolve like on a micro level to have darker colours, they were the ones that survived, whereas the ones that remained as being white were the ones that got picked up by birds. The reason for this is because there was so much soot and pollutants being put into the air in Britain, especially in these industrial towns, that actually, if you blended in and became like a black moth or like a relatively brown moth, yeah, you were like kind of near one of the factories and stuff, yeah, you could just sit there and the bird wouldn't see you, right? But if you remained as like a white moth, you stick out like a sore thumb, right? This shows just how detrimental like kind of the effects were. And you know, in the famous like patriotic British song called Jerusalem, a lot of people will sing that and will kind of overlook, you know, the actual words in it and stuff, right? So William Wordsworth, who wrote it and stuff, right? The line in it, yeah, among these dark satanic meal. He was one of the romantic writers, right? And he was criticising how the countryside of England, yeah, was being transformed into this horrible, dark place. The so-called black country, like in England, yeah, which it was, like, you know, the industrial part of like the North and the Midlands stuff, yeah. You know, it's called the Black Country for a reason. It's because of how much soot was being put into the air, right? And even Queen Victoria, when she'd travel by train going through these towns, would apparently pull down her blinds so as to not see like the dark and dinginess of the countryside, right? This gives some insight into like just how bad it was. During this Victorian era, we start to see more and more legislation against it, and we start to see popular movements. Again, like the first inklings of like environmental kind of actual movements, yeah, start to really arise. Right, so the first kind of proper like legislation that we find for this is in 1863, where with the Alkali Act. Here's the problem, right? People were making washing soap basically, and with that you need to use sodium bicarbonate, but you end up producing soda ash and you end up having to use hydrochloric acid. Now, hydrochloric acid, it's used obviously like many people like kind of in schools, like kind of like if you remember in school where you put a bit of hydrochloric acid, yeah, it's all fine. But on a mass scale, the hydrochloric gases is obviously very harmful to people's lungs and stuff, right? And so, you know, because of that, the government put in regulations to try and regulate like the hydrochloric acid. But in terms of it being really, really regulated in a serious level, it took until almost 100 years later, yeah, in 1958, with the second kind of Alkali Acts, and this actually really put a clamp on heavy industry. But now we're starting to see legislation being put on a grand scale that actually, you know, like covers things. So we end up having, for instance, the Public Health Act in 1875, yeah, which regulated pollutants and stuff. You know, actually, during this Victorian time, the River Thames, for instance, was so dirty, right, and it had such a smell because everyone would just dump all their waste into it, that people in Parliament, yeah, like they could smell the river from inside the chambers of House of Commons, and actually, like, this is when it kind of got to a point where like, right, enough, we need to do something about this. That's when they started like building sewer systems. They started building all sort of like kind of treatment systems to be able to get rid of human waste. And then also, in terms of, again, the coal and stuff, you had the Coal Abatement Society, which was set up in 1875 by Sir William Blake Richmond. So this was like one of the first kind of environmental like kind of lobbies that one could think of. But with that lobby, it took until 1926 for the Coal Abatement Act to be enacted. 1898 to 1926, you can see how seriously that people in those days actually took environmental policy. None of this really picked up until the period like after World War One, right? So for instance, in 1919, you had the Forestry Commission being set up in England, right? And so they basically bought up vast swathes of land. Their aim was either reforestation, so which is, you know, if there was a forest there before, growing kind of like growing trees to help like rebuild that forest, and also afforestation, which is a word that I did not know before doing this. Yeah, so I'm learning at the same rate you're learning. Afforestation is when you start to plant trees and build a forest where there were none before. Over the next like 10, 20 years, the Forestry Commission end up becoming the largest landowner in the UK, and because of that, the number of trees, like kind of a number of like protected forests like in Britain has skyrocketed. Actually, this is a fact that actually in the Northern Hemisphere, there are now more trees today than there were 100 years ago. So as much as we kind of do worry about like the effects of like kind of like humans like on the environment, there have also been some positives because there's been these preservation kind of like campaigns and stuff. It's been a thing of actually we have been able to turn back the tide on some things, and we're pretty confident that we can turn back the tide on other things as well. In London, in 1952, you had the Great Smog, right? Basically, the streets of London, it was just, you couldn't see like past a few feet in front of you, and that's because of all the pollutants being put into the air. There's a mixture of bad weather and the pollutants, and this smog covered the whole city, and many people end up having very adverse like effects, like due to different like problems with their lungs and stuff, yeah, because of this. Like pollution really affects the respiratory system, and even today, even like modern like 21st century and stuff, right, we're finding that schools and houses and stuff which are near like main roads and are near city centres, years and years of people's lives are being shaved off, yeah, by these pollutants. Never mind what it was like back then when you literally can't see down the end of your street because of these pollutants. But now, unlike before, we're starting to really see a bit more speed with regards to regulation, right? So like I said, the Great Smog of London was in 1952. By 1956, so only 4 years now, not like almost a whole century, right? 4 years later, we have the Clean Air Act. So people in their home used to like kind of heat their home with coal. They started to really move away from that in like kind of like because of this act, and people started moving towards gas, which burns cleaner. And you know, you had a whole bunch of different regulations and stuff to really clamp down on things. Factories now had to kind of be moved more away from the city centres and out towards like kind of like the outskirts of the city, which explains why rather than like places like London and New York being these huge kind of industrial kind of centres and stuff, yeah, you start to see more the outskirts of it. You start to see the move away to like smaller towns and stuff, and and during this period as well, because of like the early parts of like globalization and industrial decline, in the upcoming decades, more and more of these factories just naturally close down and move overseas anyway because of like cheapened labor and stuff. So many of the environmental issues that you see in places like China today are issues which we basically exported, because like these are problems that we had like 50, 60 years ago. They're now just on the other side of the world. So we started to see in more and more of this kind of like awareness for environmental like kind of regulations. Famously in 1962 there was the book Silent Spring, which came out by the biologist Rachel Carson. So her big concern was DDT, right? So DDT was a pesticide that was sprayed on crops, and it would kill the pest, but the problem is it would get into the soil, it would get into the water, it would kill many living things which weren't just like pests and stuff like that normally eat like crops. The Silent Spring was referring to the fact that actually if we continue doing this, we're now going to end up having a situation where we're going to wake up one morning and we're not going to hear birds chirping, because all the birds are going to be dead. They're going to have nothing to eat, or they're going to be poisoned from these pesticides, right? And so it was a warning kind of saying that actually if we continue using DDT and other kind of things like this, what we put into the environment, is actually going to have long-term effects that we didn't necessarily foresee. And so as a result of this, DDT ends up being banned in 1972. So just 10 years later, ends up getting banned. But the EPA, which people who've watched the Simpsons movie will know about, right? The EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, was set up by Richard Nixon in 1970. This agency really started to clamp down on all the pollutants out here. And during this time as well, as we know, with the hippie movement, with the kind of peace movement, etc., right? You started to have people again becoming more conscious about the environment, and social movements, especially with younger people, really starting to pick up steam. So you see with Greenpeace being set up in 1969, you start to see Friends of the Earth being set up around the same period as well, in 1971 I believe. All of a sudden it becomes a really big public issue. So it's not just some sidelined issue, it becomes something which more and more becomes a politicized issue. In schools, people started to teach children the importance of not littering. People started teaching the importance of not wasting resources, of recycling and all these kind of things, right? So all of this kind of came more and more from the fact of recognizing that Earth is relatively finite, that we can't just continue to run things as we had done before. We can't just continue to keep consuming things without recognizing that at a certain point we're going to run out of these resources. And so bit by bit, the kind of technology ends up it starts being more and more pushed for green technology, for renewable technology, moving away from coal, moving away from gas, moving away from oil, towards more renewable sources of energy. Apologies for that. I just realised that I got the founding date of Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth confused. So Greenpeace was set up in 1971 and Friends of the Earth, that was in 1969. Apologies for that. We'll do a whole video at some point about climate change or global warming or whatever, and talking about some of the facts and some of the data on that, as well as some of the politics with it, right? But what's interesting about the environmental movement is, as much as it might be seen as just a left-wing ideology, there's literally environmental, everything, There's eco-feminism, there's eco-libertarianism, there's eco-fascism even. So, so the environmental movement crosses the political spectrum, and many people on the right are in favour of it as well, and many people on the left are opposed to it. So don't just think of it as left wing. I know that a lot of the debate has kind of gone down that road in more recent years, where you think left wing pro environmental regulations and right wing against it. But actually there's strong conservative arguments for preserving the environment, and also there's strong left wing arguments for not overly focusing on it. So trying to get out of your head the idea that left wing care about environment and right wing don't, right? we'll go into that in a future video in terms of people's belief in the science on climate change, and also like kind of like climate skepticism, climate change skepticism, and like, well, yeah, and talking about like how much of an impact do humans actually have on the environment. From the data that we can see, it does seem that obviously humans are having impact on the environment. The debate on like kind of whether the Earth's atmosphere the Earth's temperature and everything is being drastically changed by humans, or whether it's been changed a little bit, or whether it's not been changed at all. That's a separate argument, a very important argument, but a very separate one. But what there is no debate about is the fact that we are polluting like the world, right? We are putting plastic into the seas, we're destroying habitats, and we need to be very mindful of this. You know, there's sustainable ways of farming, there's sustainable ways of building, there's sustainable ways of us living side by side with nature, yeah?